Today we're covering restructures. Restructures in FinPower Connect are a way to amend loan terms such as the interest rate, term, payment frequencies and more. These are only available on fixed term loans. It's important to note that when completing a restructure in FinPower Connect, it has an effect of essentially refinancing the account back into itself, meaning from the restructure date, the loan in a sense starts fresh on new terms. A restructure calculates and posts interest to the day before the date of the restructure, effectively compounding the interest. Whilst you can view the historic information, such as past transactions, the original schedule, etc., the user will not be able to adjust, amend, or reverse anything with an effective date prior to the restructure. Because this is the only way you can amend interest rates on a fixed term loan, it is a useful alternative to refinancing the loan should the client wish to renegotiate the interest details on a borrower's loan, as an example, while also amending other key contractual information at the same time. The restructure function can be accessed from the Actions button on an account or from the Term and Payments block in the summary on the financial page. There is also the ability to add the account restructure as an item on a workflow if desired. Page 1 of the Restructure wizard, as pictured here, you'll notice is rather similar to the other wizards we've covered of a similar nature recently. For example, the Refinance Account wizard and the Payment Arrangement wizard. We can, as expected, define the date of the restructure and complete the by whom field based on who requested the restructure or whom actioned it, depending on what is preferred by the client. A type can be selected and, like we've seen before, has an information list that can be customised and can be set to mandatory if the client requires their end users to always use a restructure type. I've covered this before, but for those who may not have seen the previous session, a type could be useful for custom reporting or as a method to identify specific accounts of this restructure type in scripting. For example, a comprehensive credit reporting hardship variation in Australia, there is a requirement to report on these variations, and this is one way that FinPower Connect can aid the client in doing so. On this first page, is the option to type in a reason if required and whether or not to create a log or generate a document detailing the changed terms post-restructure. As we've said before, it is important that the client is aware it's their responsibility as lenders to ensure that the document linked to the special event is fit for purpose and meets legislative requirements. We'll go over the sample document and where the configuration for this is in due course. The next page covers accruals and unposted transactions. Here, the user can choose to waive all or part of the accrued interest by updating the value or unticking charge to waive completely. Page 3 allows the adjusting of balance allocations as part of the restructure. For example, you can leave the interest balance as allocated to interest, or formally capitalise it to the principal balance. Either way, post-restructure, that balance will no longer impact the overdue balance. It's important to capitalise regardless. The paste button next to the principal balance column will automatically put the total balance into the principal column and create the balancing adjustments in the other columns as required, like shown in the image here. There is also the ability to restructure the overdue balance. If you click the clear button next to the net restructure overdue field, the overdue balance will be reduced to 0 and the arrears will be capitalised. It's also important to note that you need to clear a prepaid value prior to completing the restructure. This page and its functionality is a good example of how FinPower Connect can cater for restructures where the underlying reason is hardship, so some or all of the overdue balance is cleared and new terms are agreed on going forward. Which brings us to the next page. The financial page. Here we can adjust the term, either extending it or choosing to keep the original maturity date and recalculating the payments accordingly. Any relevant standard transactions can be added here, either manually or by setting it on the account type as with a frequency of restructure. The payment frequency, balloon, residual value interest rate, type and cycle can all potentially be amended here if required. The summary below shows the impact of these changes. In our example here, you'll see our chosen date will extend the maturity by 731 days. The interest rate has been reduced and the payments have decreased in value. You'll notice this page is very similar to the financial pages in the other wizards, like the refinance wizard and the new account wizard, but there are differences, like for example, the addition of the promise tab. If the plan is not to capitalise the entire overdue balance, you will not be able to complete a true restructure, as you cannot restructure and leave a balance overdue without at least a promise to pay being added. This is where the promise tab assists. If we had left a net restructure overdue balance on the previous page, like shown in the image here, of say $334.06, capitalising $3,000, you'll notice that on the promise tab, the remaining overdue balance has pre-populated into the promise total field, allowing the user to easily enter promise details to arrange payment of the overdue value. Here I've entered the number 5 in the number field and used the calculate button to generate the promise payment value. Once we click add promise, the payments are added and ready to go along with the additional changes to the loan made in the financial details area. You can, as with the payment arrangement wizard, click the calculate button again up the top to recalculate the regular repayment value after the promise has been added to keep things in line with the maturity date or final date information that has been selected. The next tab shows our old friend overriding payments, seen in the account payment arrangement wizard as well. We've covered how this page works before in the payment arrangement session, but if further help is required, don't forget you can press F1 from this screen and be taken to our online help page. Most help pages do contain a button strip section which details what each of these buttons do and is very useful. As you can see in this image here, our promised payments have been added successfully. On our payment schedule tab, we can also see our promises as well as the new regular payments we've configured in the financial section above. The schedule can also be accessed by clicking this schedule button here and saved and exported if desired. The options tab should look familiar as well, as this is seen in the new account wizard, etc. Here we can amend things like the payment allocation. So you could choose to change to interest-only payments here as an example. There's also the option to change the default interest rate basis. So you could look to change this from a premium rate to fixed or a plus rate. There is a detailed explanation on the differences between these three available in our online help section, but as a brief rundown, the premium rate will charge the default interest at the rate set, i.e. 5% per annum, on the defaulted balance, which will either be the overdue balance itself, the entire balance, or the contractual overdue balance, depending on your other account type settings. Fixed rate will charge default interest on the difference between the default rate and the normal interest rate. So in this case, if the client wanted to use this option, but effectively have the default interest rate calculated at 5%, the default interest rate itself would need to be set to 25%, so then the difference would be 5%. The plus rate charges default interest at a combined rate of the interest rate and default interest rate, hence plus rate. So in this case, default interest would be charged at a total of 25%. Also available on this tab is the ability to change whether or not interest is charged on interest. If using a balloon payment, whether or not the last regular payment should be included with the balloon, and adding in or amending the other interest rate details. Page 5 of the wizard is only available if the Create Log option was chosen back on the first page, and details can be entered here as desired, like shown in the image here. Once Finish is clicked, the following warning will be displayed. And once you click Yes, the restructure is complete. If the Restructure Advice option was selected at the beginning, this will be generated and will display the information pertaining to the restructure, based also on what has been set to display in the constants for the document. This example here shows a detailed promise disclosure, followed by a comparison between the restructured details and the last variation, which could be a previous restructure, a payment arrangement, or the original term, depending on the settings on the document and, of course, the history of the loan itself prior to the restructure. Post-restructure, you'll notice it's clearly marked on the account that a restructure has occurred, and it will have its own restructured schedule as shown on the image here. Common warnings. As restructures are quite involved, meaning attempted changes may impact many aspects of a loan, we thought we'd cover some common errors and warnings that pop up and explain why they occur and in turn how to avoid them. Cannot calculate new account for restructure. This one is pretty self-explanatory, but it appears if the account processes are not up to date. It would generally not appear in a real-life situation, but often in testing databases. This one's just something to be aware of. The overdue balance. If it has an overdue balance, as mentioned before, if some or all of the overdue balance is not being renegotiated and capitalised, a promise must be added for the remaining overdue value, or the restructure will not be able to be processed. In this situation, the following warning will appear. Whilst you can backdate a restructure in FinPower Connect, you cannot backdate an account that has already been restructured before the date of that restructure. You can also not restructure an account twice on the one day. If you attempt to do so, you'll be presented with the following warning, which explains as much. As a result, it's important to make sure all your ducks are in a row, so to speak, before processing the restructure. Where pre-computed interest is set, a loan cannot be restructured and you will receive the following warning. This is partly because the interest for the life of the loan has already been charged up front, so a restructure could effectively allow the client to be charged twice in interest for the same period. The client could, however, perform a refinance if absolutely required, but should ensure they are keeping within the relevant legislative requirements, like high-cost loan legislation in New Zealand, which prevents too many high-cost loans within a short period of time. Backdating transactions is no longer available, so attempting to complete transactions with an effective date prior to the date of restructure will also fail, as the restructure date is like drawing a line in the sand between the old terms and the new, which is why we said at the beginning that it's essentially refinancing, but instead of creating a new account record in FinPower Connect, it's refinanced back into the existing account record. This error shows attempting to make a backdated payment to a restructured loan. You'll get a similar error when attempting a withdrawal. And as you'd expect, this also applies to attempting a backdated payment arrangement or promise, as shown in this error message here. Again, these errors are why it's important to ensure all ducks are in a row prior to actioning the restructure. And by that, of course, we mean ensuring that any manual adjustments like additional payments, payment reversals, etc. are completed prior to processing your restructure. It's also important to highlight situations like payments that have not yet dishonoured. Therefore, if your client is not using cleared dates for payments and does not get presented with a warning about uncleared funds, as an example, they should be made aware that this can cause an error when importing dishonoured transactions with a date prior to the loan's restructure, as they will not be able to be processed. Restructure-related settings. So the restructure advice, like with payment arrangements, as mentioned, there is a special account document event for restructures found on the account type settings as shown shown here in this image. The sample APA document is set up to handle restructures and can be defined here. As mentioned earlier, we do need to reiterate that this is a sample document only, and it is the responsibility of the lender to ensure the document is fit for purpose, including meeting any relevant legislative requirements, particularly surrounding disclosure. More information can be found relating to these requirements by researching the CCCFA in New Zealand or the NCCPA in Australia. On the Account Types Other page, and we've touched on this before, but the setting to enable restructures on the account type is found here. And this will only appear on account types with an underlying class of fixed term. And permissions. It's highly likely that, particularly with clients with a larger portfolio, that they will not want all users having the ability to complete restructures. Therefore, there is the following permission that is available to control which non-admin users can complete a restructure by either allowing or denying this permission for the relevant roles. The system basis for this permission is allow, so unless it has been specifically set to deny, all users will initially be able to complete a restructure should it be allowed on the account type. The Permissions Explorer is located under Tools, User Security, Permissions, and there is a session available on our YouTube channel already on permissions should you wish to know more. Alternatives to restructures. So as we've covered in our other sessions, if an account restructure is either unavailable due to the account class or settings or doesn't quite achieve what you're after, payment arrangements, depending of course on the account type configuration, can achieve some of what a restructure can, like amending payment amounts, frequencies, etc., but they will not update the contractual values. If changes to contractual values like term, contracted repayments, etc. are required, if a restructure is unavailable, a refinance might be the best option. We've come to the end of our session for today. As always, if there's any additional information you seek, don't hesitate to contact application support for user interface queries or code support in relation to code-specific questions. Next week, our code team will be taking the session